So talk about gatekeeping in role-playing games, especially in the context of the OSR, is one of those topics that just keeps coming up every once in a while. It's a cyclical thing. But I think people are actually not getting the point of it. And I think I wanted to talk a little bit about gatekeeping in RPGs, and especially in the OSR, today on Greyhawk Grognard. So the old Urban Dictionary defines gatekeeping as a word used to describe when someone sets a standard or limit on what someone must do to call themselves a true fan of something or someone. And I would expand that to include to call themselves a player of something, of a particular game or type of game. And I've always maintained that gatekeeping in that sense really isn't possible in a role-playing game context, because just because I set a particular standard for my players or my group or my table or whatever, and just because I want to play a particular game or a particular style or a particular type of game, doesn't stop you from doing something different. So my point has always been there is no gate to keep, because I can't stop you from playing 4th edition or 5th edition or Pathfinder or whatever, just because I might not like them. I actually do like 5th for a couple of different reasons, but first is always my go-to. But I don't have that power to say you can't play whatever. You by definition, I don't have that authority over you unless you give it to me. And I can't see any reason why anybody would want to give up that freedom that they have. And the same goes for OSR games. I mean, the OSR encompasses a specific style of play, modeled on what the game was like back in the 70s and 80s, and in a lot of ways it's modeled on what we think or wanted it to be like back in the 70s or 80s, but it's a pretty coherent style of play. There's an adversarial relationship between the DM and the players, but there's also a social contract wherein the DM isn't going to just be completely unfair and trying to kill the players, because that robs the game of its fun, and you don't want to play that way. It harkens back to older versions of the game, 1st edition, basic, 2nd edition, those styles and styles of rules. It tends to be more rules light in the way that, say, Old School Essentials is, or Swords and Wizardry, but it doesn't have to be, because there were a lot of games back in the day, 1st edition AD&D comes to mind, that are definitely not rules light, that are rules heavy. In fact, that's the version I prefer, so I always give a little pushback when people say that OSR means rules light, because it doesn't. The mere fact that the 1st edition of Chivalry and Sorcery exists and would absolutely be considered an OSR game, because it was out in the 70s. But my God, if anybody wants to call that rules light, they need something examined. But anyway, the idea that there's a gate somewhere that I can, with a word, stop somebody from playing an OSR game is, to me, absurd. The gate doesn't exist, because I can't stop you from going to your kitchen table and getting out OSE or Swords and Wizardry or Holmes Basic or whatever and playing the game. That's different, I think, than making an argument about definitions of what the OSR is. So if somebody tries to say that, say, 4th edition is an OSR game, I think that there is legitimate legitimate grounds for pushing back on that assertion, because the OSR has a particular definition. It's a rather expansive definition, and it can be quite nebulous in certain areas. Not everybody agrees on what the boundaries are, and so forth. So you can have a discussion about it. But once you there is a line that I think the vast majority of people who self-identify as OSR players and members of the OSR community, which is not necessarily the same thing. That once you cross a particular line, then you're no longer in OSR territory, and I think a lot of people fail to make that distinction. That if someone was to say, the new Dune role playing game, which I understand is great, but if somebody was to say that's an OSR game, I think there's legitimate reasons to push back on that assertion. And I don't count that as gatekeeping. It's a question of definitions, and you have to maintain, unless you have some sort of a definition, even if it's a vague one, as I said, then language becomes meaningless. So there is a certain point at which definitions matter. Now, that all being said, there's also a vast difference between gatekeeping and table keeping. And I think that's where I at least make a very strong distinction, because even though I don't have the power, unless it's given to me by somebody for some incomprehensible reason, I can't say you're not part of the OSR because X. You don't you don't play rules as written, so you can't be OSR. Or you don't play just rules light games, so you can't be OSR. I think that is different than saying, I don't want you at my table because we play a rules-heavy game. We play first edition, and it's not rules light. There's that difference right there between, I say who I want at my table, and I say, and I get to challenge your self definition. And I think that is a big distinction. If I want to say, hey, I only want to play with people at my table who share my political views, that's a perfectly legitimate thing for me to do. If I feel more comfortable around people who share my politics, then it's my call. It's my game. It's my table. It's my kitchen. If I want to do that, I don't do that because I don't like to exclude people on that basis. But, if somebody else wants to make that call, that's fine, because table keeping is perfectly legitimate. But in terms of gatekeeping, in the sense of that definition of setting a limit or a standard on what somebody must do to call themselves OSR in this case, outside of a definition that gives the term some level of meaning, and I think everybody has their own definition specifics, but I think in general one could say it's dealing with older games that emulate older games, and a particular style of play that emulates the way we played in the 70s and 80s. I think that's legitimate. Having a definition is not gatekeeping. Gatekeeping seems to be rather more arbitrary than that. So anyway, I hope my rambling makes sense to some people, that I honestly don't think gatekeeping is a thing, because I don't think anybody has that authority. And on the other hand, I do think it's legitimate to have a definition of a thing. For example, the example on Urban Dictionary that I'm looking at, I'm a big fan of Doctor Who. When did you start watching? Back in 2005. And then the other guy says, I was watching the classic series, and you can't really call yourself a true fan. I don't think that that's what's happening. I think that's a question of the definition. And I think nobody is saying that if you don't like old game, that if you like new games, you're somehow bad or whatever. But I think that the question of there's a definition, a nebulous one, but there's still a definition, I think is different than establishing a standard that's arbitrary and designed to exclude people. So anyway, hope this made sense. Let me know what you think in the comments of the idea of gatekeeping in the OSR. I mean, I honestly, I keep hearing people make the accusation that the OSR does it, but I've never actually seen it in action. So maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe there is more to this that I'm not aware of. So please do let me know in the comments your thoughts on the matter. What would be an example of true gatekeeping with somebody making a definition designed to exclude other people beyond beyond the mere having of a definition of a term. I'd be interested to see what people's thoughts are on this. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will talk to you later. Thanks for watching today's video. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Below you'll find links to my Patreon, which helps make these videos possible. You'll also find the web store where you can buy my books, and my blog where you'll find all sorts of free downloads and other articles. Thanks, and have a great day.